Instead of my office, let us use one of these conference rooms. They're much nicer and have more chairs, Regent Oakmore said as we walked. Sounds great, Your Highness, Nash replied. We walked a little further before the Regent halted and gestured to a closed door. I awkwardly froze, trying to figure out what he wanted, but Yulk stepped past me and opened the door. Oakmore caught my confusion, gave me a slight smile, and nodded warmly to Yulk before entering the room. I guess maybe royalty doesn't open doors for other people? I worked my way through my confusion as we entered the room. My jaw nearly dropped. Oakmore had described it as a conference room, but that hardly did it justice. The room was luxuriously large, and its stone walls were covered in various banners, one of which I had seen while in Kirkana. There were various other decorations spread throughout the room, like swords, maces, and a hand from a large clawed monster. In the center of the room was a massive wooden table with intricate engravings that were inlaid with gold. The chairs surrounding the table matched its engravings, but had cushions on their seats, arms, and backs. Their backs were extra tall and reminded me of the expensive reclining chairs that influencers peddled for ridiculous amounts of money back home. I was wondering if they could recline when Oakmore sat and gestured to the chairs across from him. Please sit down, we have much to discuss, he said with another small smile. We sat, with Yulk to my left and Nash to my right. Renv sat next to Nash and sighed contently. The chairs were remarkably comfortable, and I had to fight the urge to melt into their cushions. It's the first cushioned chair I've sat in since coming to this world. When I get back home, I'm never taking cushioned seats for granted again. Oakmore began by verifying the information he'd been given thus far. Yes, I am from another world. I do, in fact, need to eat both plants and meat. Yilda Alta adopted me into the Alta clan. No, I wasn't technically the one who killed the thing in the dungeon. We came here to deliver the missive and to see if we could get some rubbings translated. Yes, I am desperately trying to get back home, and I miss my family terribly. Well, on that note, are you planning on seeing our true king? Regent Oakmore asked with an eager grin. Actually, Your Majesty, Yulk began. Yes, we are, I interrupted, surprised at the firmness in my voice. Your king is a dragon, right? I asked the follow-up question to put Yulk into a difficult position. To argue with me, he would have to interrupt the regent. I don't know a lot about monarchy or regency, but I do know that he's been calling Oakmore Your Majesty, and it's usually a bad idea to interrupt someone who requires that honorific. Not just any dragon, Oakmore said, beaming with pride. A high dragon. A normal dragon is fearsome and respectable, one of the most terrible and deadly beasts to ever exist. But it is just a beast. They have intelligence and motivations comparable to puppers or narses. High dragons are much smarter and deadlier than their less evolved cousins. What do you mean? I asked. I dared a glance at Yulk, who was staring at me. His expression betrayed confusion rather than anger, though. I felt a stab of guilt as I realized he was trying to figure out why I had interrupted him and changed our plans on the fly instead of feeling angry at me for doing so. I didn't bother looking at Nash, though. I can feel the venom in his gaze. High dragons are near divinity when it comes to their intelligence. The legends tell of high dragon elders accurately predicting the outcomes of battles years before they were fought. While that may be an exaggeration, the high dragons were instrumental in driving the demons and Aniels out of our world. Oakmore's tone took a sad turn. A lot of them died to do that, though, including the parents of our true king. He avenged them in a glorious battle that lasted for 3 weeks and returned to Bolasir for his coronation. I'm not sure what happened during that battle, but he promptly issued a declaration of regency and fell into a slumber that has lasted ever since. A declaration of regency? Yes. The Declaration of Regency governs the requirements for my office. Essentially, I act as king in his absence. When I die, there will be an election, and a new regent will be chosen. Who chooses the new regent? The people of the land, of course. I paused for a moment. A democratic monarchy sounds alien to me, but on the other hand, I don't really know much about kings and queens. Rather than exposing my ignorance, I opted to ask something else. High Chief ElevenLabs says you're his blood brother. How did that happen? I asked. ElevenLabs and I adventured together in our youth. We have saved each other's lives on multiple occasions, and when it came time for him to take over the post of High Chief, we decided to take a blood oath, the elf answered. At the time, the intention was for me to come to his aid as an adventurer whenever he needed it. Then my father passed and I was pressured into running for regent, namely because no one else wanted to. Now our blood oath requires the both of us to come to each other's aid for as long as we rule. So until you die? Or, wait, what happens to you if the High Dragon wakes up? I asked. I will resign my post as regent and take up whatever duty our king offers me, the elf smiled. Or I just retire. I have enough savings to last me for the rest of my life and make sure my children get a good inheritance. Retire? You wouldn't go back to adventuring? Oh, I'm far too old for that sort of thing. Oakmore waved his hand dismissively. Really? You don't look all that old. Oakmore began laughing, and all three of my companions chuckled along with him. I looked around with a confused expression, seeking an answer until it finally hit me. Even back home, elves don't age all that much. Damn it. Elves do not typically demonstrate our age upon our faces, Oakmore explained as he wiped a tear. Apologies for my outburst. Your question was simply unexpected. I likely have a couple of decades left until I'm infirm, but my adventuring days are well behind me. What level did you manage to get to, Your Majesty? Nash asked. I rose to level 62, thanks mostly to ElevenLabs. He could probably return to adventuring if the situation arose. Really? Yolk asked. I thought he was older than you, Your Highness. He is, but he's also of royal lineage, Oakmore answered before frowning slightly. Ah, but I digress. I'm fairly certain that the details of the royal lineage are secret, so if you wish to learn more, you will have to ask him directly. Yolk nodded and retreated into his thoughts, rubbing his chin to process what he'd heard. Nash furrowed his brows and crossed his arms, also an indication that he was thinking. Renv and I simply looked at the two orcs, confused by their reactions. Now, Nick, I cannot help but notice that you have been omitting my honorific this entire time, Oakmore said with a sly grin. I have chosen not to take this as an insult, but I cannot help but wonder why. Apologies, Your Highness, I said rapidly. I've never met a regent before, and we didn't have royalty or nobility where I'm from. Truly? He asked as his eyebrows rose. Absolutely remarkable. How are your people governed? I explained the various types of government in the United States to Regent Oakmore to the best of my ability, which inevitably led to more questions about my world. Thankfully, Oakmore seemed more interested in our various forms of entertainment and food than our other technology, so I was able to easily avoid the subject of weapons. In this world, adventurers hold the majority of the combat abilities. They have to train those abilities and hone them to be able to cause massive amounts of destruction. Guns and nukes would change that power dynamic very quickly, and even pointing out the possibility of their existence may eventually lead to someone creating them. Can't be too careful. You can look at cute pets while communicating with anyone in the world almost instantaneously. Oakmore leaned back in his chair. Marvelous. Simply marvelous. I know it's unlikely to ever happen, but I can't help but wish to see such wonders with my own eyes. Fucking hells. Me too, Renv said. I glanced at Renv and realized that everyone else had followed suit. Nash and Yulk looked shocked, and Regent Oakmore raised his left eyebrow. The already diminutive dwarf shrank even further at our various gazes. My apologies, Your Majesty, he stammered. I didn't mean to swear in your presence. It won't happen again, Your Highness. See that it doesn't. Though your reaction is more than understandable. Oakmore straightened. Well, my curiosity is sated for now. Please, allow me to accompany you to our true king. Watching His Royal Majesty's slumber may sound dull, but there truly is nothing quite like it. The regent rose from his chair, and we followed suit. He led us back to where we had entered the building and whispered something to the woman at the front desk. Her green eyes narrowed at Oakmore with disapproval, but she didn't say anything. He grinned at her and gestured for us to follow him. When we left the building, he took a deep breath. Ah, fresh air, it's been so long, He chuckled. So, do any of you know why our streets are wider than that of other kingdoms? So that your king can walk through the kingdom when he awakens, your majesty? Yolk asked. Correct. My, you are a bright one. When His Royal Highness first entered his slumber, he did so in a sparsely populated portion of the kingdom, not wanting to get in the way of our growth. However, his subjects love him so much that many of them moved here, and everything was built around him to make sure that he would be comfortable when he awoke. We've even cleared the airspace in case he needs to fly. How many people live here, your majesty? I asked. Our last census has us at 11,000 with a margin of error of 1%. This is the most densely populated portion of Bolasir, and if we had cities, it would likely be our capital. Oh, and don't fret over my honorific, Nick. I understand now that your culture is vastly different from ours, and I'm willing to treat you as a sort of diplomat. Thank you, sir. Your Highness, I didn't see any fortifications as we approached. Why is that? Nash asked. Just because you didn't see our fortifications doesn't mean they aren't there, Oakmore winked. Which would be more effective at routing an invading army? A simple stone wall or arrows and spells coming from all around you at impossible angles? Nash's eyes widened, and he fell into a contemplative silence. We are not invaded often either, Oakmore continued. Our only two neighbors are the Night Kingdom and the Unified Chiefdoms. The Unified Chiefdoms meet us at the south and west, and the Night Kingdom meets us at the north and west. It's just ocean on the east. Since the Unified Chiefdoms are friendly with us, our only threat is the Night Kingdom. They've tried invading us before, but they rarely make it past the Fae with anything resembling an invasion force. The Fae fight them? I asked. Some do. Most prefer trickery and subterfuge, but those that take pleasure in direct action are quite brutal. The Blood and Bone Fae especially. Blood and Bone Fae? Do those live in the deep wild forest? Odd of you to ask that. Oakmore studied me for a moment. No, both the Blood and the Bone Fae tend to live along our northern border in a place the Fae call Grim Star's Wood. They have been known to migrate somewhat, but never so far as the deep wild forest. How are you aware of the Fae living there? I explained our encounter with Tits and Algebran as we continued our walk. The regent waited patiently as I explained their attempt to trick us into giving them our names, and his eyebrows rose as I told him that I named them. He stopped dead in his tracks when I told him that they'd turned into Archfey, and the rest of us quickly followed suit. They became Archfey? He asked. Yes, your majesty, I stammered, caught completely off guard by his sudden seriousness. You made them into Archfey? I suppose so, sir. Oakmore leaned toward me and studied me carefully. I tried not to lean away, but his piercing gaze forced my instincts to kick in. After a few moments of intense scrutiny, the regent resumed his former posture and began to laugh. Oh, by the gods, he said as he recovered. That's going to anger someone powerful, I'm sure. No matter, that's a problem for another time. Let's continue on, shall we? He gestured for us to follow as he began to walk once more. The four of us looked at each other and quickly trailed after the regent. Who would get mad? I asked. The Fae Chroniclers for sure, but you don't have to worry about them. The only one you might have to worry about is Muldobran, but he's likely to be more angry at the new Arch-Fae than at you. He glanced at me and caught the concern on my face. Oh, don't worry about them. Muldobran will probably just give them an earful and a hard time for a few years. I was about to ask what he knew about Muldobran when a certain smell caught my attention. The musky scent of reptile with a hint of rotten eggs? No, that's sulfur. I looked around for the source of the smell, but it became obvious as we turned a corner. The high dragon looked exactly like what I have seen in video games. It was resting on a platform with stairs, curled up with its front legs supporting the base of its neck and its head resting on its tail. I could barely make out the claws of its hind legs poking out from underneath its wings. Shining white scales covered its body, glimmering in a massive sunbeam, the first I'd seen so far. The only thing that was missing was a treasure hoard underneath it. This is our true king. Oakmore took a few steps and gestured dramatically. Isinerath, king of Bolasir and bane of the horde. My eyes remained on the high dragon as I followed the regent. Its body slow expanded and deflated slightly as it breathed, causing a sort of shimmering effect from its scales. It was bigger than an elephant, but breathtakingly beautiful. I looked at its face and noticed that its eyes were moving under their lids, like it was dreaming. I was trying to imagine what it was dreaming about when the movement stopped. Everything in my body told me that it was awake and watching me. I felt the blood drain from my face and froze in my tracks. Oakmore and my companions turned to look at me, confused at my sudden halt. The dragon's eyes snapped open, looking directly into my own. "Yes, get that out of your mouth! Yemsh mover!" I tried to reply as I spit the befuddled troll back onto the ground. "You know better than to eat trolls without cooking them first, boy," my father scolded me. "Yes, father. Really now, they are quite filthy. Go wash your mouth out," mother said. The troll looked at my parents and then back at me with confusion. It could not understand what we were saying and looked confused at being spared. It sat there nonplussed, as if it were the one being scolded. I dismissively waved a claw at it, which released it from whatever stuporous spell was holding its poor little mind. It rose and began to run, and I walked over to the river to obey my mother's command. A shame that my parents caught me. Actually, how did they catch me? They were arguing they couldn't have been paying attention to me. Never mind, it doesn't matter. Trolls are delicious. They have chewy, juicy muscles with plenty of succulent fat, which makes for a rather perfect mouthful of meat. The bones add a magnificent crunch, too. My parents are correct that trolls are filthy little creatures, but I've never minded the grime. It's just seasoning, really. I dipped my head in the river and drew water into my mouth. It was cool and refreshing, and it took more than a little willpower to spit my first mouthful back into the river. I took in some more, swished it around, gargled, and spat once more. Once my mouth was sufficiently rinsed, I gulped down gallons of the fresh water, along with a few inattentive fish. Then I laid on my back and my wings on the rocks as I watched my parents talk. "You can't be serious, Sira Navarro. The demons have nearly wiped out the elves. What good would it do for us to help them now, of all times?" my mother asked. A strange smell nearly distracted me, but I wanted to hear my father's response. My father is wise, but he has a blind spot in his wisdom in regards to demons. He hates them more than I have ever seen anyone hate anything, and mother is right to worry for his logic. "Don't cry my name wantonly, Esramil. There is no need for such disrespect," my father replied with a flick of his tongue. "While it is true that the elves have taken severe casualties, they are not extinct yet. The threat of their extinction is imminent, though, which means they will be all the more grateful for our aid. They'll have no issues submitting to our rule, and we can finally merge our two kingdoms into one." He's talking about Bolasir and Yivanita. Bolasir is our kingdom, and Yivanita is the independent elven kingdom. In ages past, the elves managed to convince one of my ancestors to allow them to self-govern. Recently, it was occupied by the demons before being liberated by the Anyels. Once the elves rebelled against the Anyels, the demons quickly reoccupied it. The elves have no royalty left, and very little in the way of nobility. My father has made an excellent point. At the moment, Bolasir is strong. The demons and the Anyels have left us alone, with the exception of their skirmishes spilling into our land. Yivanita is ravaged, but if it were to combine with Bolasir, we would be able to help the elves rebuild their homes and businesses in record time. And if we don't, it won't be long before the demons have eradicated the elves and turned their attentions to us. That damned smell again. Where is it? I looked around, but there was not a single clue to its origin. It smelled familiar, but also hauntingly alien. It was comforting, disturbing, lovely, and threatening all at once. It's a smell that I feel I should remember from somewhere, but have never encountered before. Or have I? Unable to find its origin, I turned back to my parents. "Bah, they are short-minded like the rest of the Mer," my mother said with a dismissive wave of her claw. "They'll be grateful to us this generation and perhaps the next, but by the third generation they will demand freedom to once again create their illusory territories. We'll barely be better off. It's not worth the risk of fighting the demons. My dear, the elves that live under our rule are happy. The elves of Yivanita will see this and be happy as well. Only those who are mistreated desire independence, and we will certainly be a better option than those damnable demons. I looked to the sky in contemplation. The demons. I'd eaten a demon once. It tasted terrible and took forever to digest. Wait, that's wrong. It is taking forever to digest. Oh right, this is a dream. Mother and father are long dead, and not even their bones remain. The demons had made certain of that. I looked back to my parents, and indeed they were gone. My father had eventually talked my mother into fighting the demons, and I had helped. They were both slain during the conflict, and I had lost myself in rage and grief. My wrath was unstoppable, and the demon lord that had taken their lives is currently being dissolved in my stomach. I then became king of Bolasir and merged Yvanita into my domain with no argument from the elves. I have been napping among them ever since, leaving them to their own devices. That damned smell again. I awoke, being careful to keep my eyes closed. The demon in my belly made me tired, like I'd always just eaten a rather large lunch. A benefit to this is that my nutritional needs are constantly fulfilled, but the downside is that it's difficult to concentrate on ruling while I'm in such a state. My solution to this was simple. I decided to name a regent and sleep until I got hungry again. However, sleeping indefinitely is impossible, and every time I awoke, the elves would lose their minds with glee. They would ask me what they should be doing and how they should go about doing it, and it would take forever to get caught up enough to adequately make those decisions. So I decided to pretend to sleep, even when I was awake, so that they could go about their business. Before I knew it, though, it had been multiple generations since I'd last spoken to the elves. So many generations that I no longer understood their tongue. It would be terribly awkward if I were to reveal my ruse. This smell has aroused my curiosity, though. Needing to know where it's coming from, I silently cast True Vision and looked through my eyelids. I saw that the elves had redecorated once again. My view of the sky remained unobstructed, though, and I could see that the towering trees had continued to grow during my latest slumber. Judging from how much larger they'd become, it had only been about 80 years since my last stealthy awakening. Those 80 years must have seen quite the economic boom, too. The hill I have been resting on now had stairs, with roads leading away from me and winding through the trees. I was impressed that they had managed to do this without waking me. On each side of the roads were buildings that were definitely elven, but reeked of gnomes, dwarves, and orcs. Each building appeared to be specially carved from a tree, but with the obvious advertisements and signs denoting commerce. Shops, perhaps. The elves were none the wiser to my awakening, and continued about their business. Some children were being led by an adult who was speaking in a very condescending tone. Must be a teacher speaking to students. Most of their eyes were wide, which is the proper response to seeing something as gargantuan and graceful as I, but others appeared to be bored. I fought the urge to open my eyes to startle the little cretins. I looked around some more and saw another noteworthy group approaching me. 2 orcs, an elf, a dwarf, and something else. I'd nearly mistaken it for a pig kobold, but it was walking fully upright and seemed to be speaking with the rest of the group. There were 2 other big clues that it wasn't a pig kobold, though. Its ears were round, and it was the thing giving off the intriguing smell. Pork smells like prey, as do kobolds. This doesn't smell like prey. I'm not certain of what it smells like, but it's definitely not prey. I suspect that it would put up as much of a fight as the demon in my belly if I were to try to eat it. Perhaps even more of a fight, considering how injured this particular demon had been by the time I decided to devour it. I turned my eyes toward my stomach. Hirgurus the Decimator had been in my belly for over 1,000 years by now. His regeneration abilities had slowed his degradation to a crawl, but there's hardly any meat left on his bones. Even if I were to regurgitate him and allow the regeneration to happen, his mind would never recover fully. The best-case scenario for him would be a complete loss of memory and faculty. Actually, given his reputation, that would be the best-case scenario for everyone. Hirgurus had tortured and murdered hundreds of thousands of mer, and the cruelty of his tortures had been more well known than his near immortality. My advisors at the time had told me that he couldn't be stopped. I fought the urge to smile as I turned my attention back to the group approaching me. It had taken a millennia, but I had finally beat the unbeatable. Hergaris had been known far and wide as the immortal lord of demons, and I used him as sustenance until all that remained of his identity had been destroyed, a fate worthy of such a despicable being. The elf with the group gestured at me, and the smell-bearer suddenly stopped. Its eyes widened in alarm as they made contact with my own. The smell became sharp with fear. It knows. A spark of fear alit my rage when I realized that this being had seen through my ruse, a potential foe, one that could destroy me if it were allowed to grow. My anger caused my breath to quicken, and the smell suddenly became familiar to me. Gods! They were actively watching this thing, and one had even interacted with it. Would they intervene if I were to try to destroy this thing here and now? Or could it be that they interfered with its fate to bring it before me? Is it meant to be an ally or an assassin? There's only one real way to find out what they're planning. I opened my eyes. The creature's skin tone changed from a slight pink to pale white, and I noted with a small measure of satisfaction that the bored children who had been annoying me earlier were now stunned. The creature's comrades were facing it, but the bald orc slowly tracked his gaze back to me. First, his face showed curiosity, then shock. A moment later, everyone except the creature was on their knees. I raised my head to look at it with both eyes. "Why are you still standing, fool?" I asked it. "Do you not know your betters by instinct?" A small measure of confusion managed to peek past the fear that was apparent on its face. I recalled that language had evolved over the years and suddenly felt a pang of self-consciousness. What good is a king that no one can understand? A small smile creeped over the face of the elf that had been guiding the group. "My lord, if I may," he asked. "I doubt that we will get anywhere if you do not," I said, masking my surprise at finding someone who still spoke High Draken. The elf stood, put his hand on the creature's shoulder, and whispered something to it. The creature kneeled so rapidly that I heard its knee hit the ground with what had to be a painful amount of force. My anger subsided at this show of deference, knowing now that it was not arrogance that led to such disrespect. It was either ignorance or fear, both of which can be forgiven. "Your Royal Majesty King Isinerath, I am your humble regent Visilisthe Oakmore. May I present to you Nick Smith, Nash Alta, and Yulk Alta," the elf said as he bowed low. "I have just awoke and am in no mood for epithets and magniloquence, Regent," I said. "You will speak plainly. What have you brought before me that reeks of godly plots and interference?" My words caught the regent by surprise. He paused, then looked at the creature. His shock was quickly subdued, however, and he turned back to me. "Your Majesty, this is a human. He is named Nick Smith and was found within a dungeon in a neighboring chiefdom. I know nothing of godly plots and interference, I'm afraid," he said. "You should be," I spat, my anger flaring once again. "One does not become the subject of godly interference ignorantly. Either you are lying to me, or the human is hiding his interactions with gods from you, likely at the behest of said gods." "I will ask him about it, sire." I made a circular motion with my claw to indicate that the regent should be quick with his questions. The human was hesitant to speak, but after a moment there was discussion between the two. The orc with braids appeared confused, but the bald one gave the impression that he had been granted clarification. The dwarf looked lost and alarmed during the entire conversation. The regent asked several questions, and once the discussion was over, he explained to me what he had learned. The human had been caught in an explosion caused by bandits and lost consciousness when he used all his magic to heal his friend. This was when he had met a being that said it was occasionally called a god. I nodded as he explained that the god wanted the human to appear before me and that I would put him on the path to returning to his world. This piqued my interest. Not only had the god encouraged this human to appear before me, likely knowing that my curiosity would get the better of me, but it had also presumed that I would be willing to help the human in some capacity. I examined it closely, using various vision magics for a complete investigation. Everything about him is strange. The first thing I noticed is that his magic core is completely artificial and contains much more magic than a mortal's magic core should. Its channels are extremely efficient and lack any sort of subtlety as well. A sorcerer's magical capabilities were often impacted by how efficient these channels are. and as such, the human is likely capable of terrible acts of magic. The next thing I noted is the amount of metal within its body. Within its skull is an object that seems to interface directly with each part of its brain. Floating through its blood, lymph, and bile are extremely small chunks of metal that seem to be moving of their own volition. After examining them closely, I realized that they are extremely small machines performing various tasks. Unlike most machines I had seen before, these are not made of iron or steel, but various precious metals for reasons undeterminable. The final thing I determined is how different its anatomy and physiology appear to be from the mortals of this world. Some organs are shared with the orcs, others are shared with the elves and dwarves. Some have different compositions but seem to perform similar functions. Others are completely unique to the human and serve functions that are nearly unnoticeable. There is also evidence of massive amounts of surgery, but someone had managed to minimize this evidence. It certainly appears to be otherworldly, I told the regent. I do not know how I would go about aiding his return to his world, though, nor am I inclined to try, given the circumstances regarding this request. I must beg your forgiveness and mercy, my liege. The elf placed his forehead upon the ground. The circumstances behind this boy's presence in our realm are tragic, and it would pain me dearly to see his quest unfulfilled. I dare not pretend to know the motives or missions of the gods, nor do I presume to begin to imagine the reasons behind your disdain for them, but I cannot help but beg your grace, sire. You dare beg my grace with the very same epithets and magniloquence that I told you to abandon mere moments ago, boy? I demanded with a low growl. Paul, I'm sorry, he replied. This just isn't how I imagined this would go. Memories of the elves of old bringing me gifts and gratitude for saving them from the demons flooded back to me. They were ecstatic whenever I would awaken from my slumber and even host feasts to celebrate. A small stab of guilt pierced the iciness in my heart as I realized that even after several generations had passed, my people still love me. Very well, I sighed. Explain the human circumstances to me. Regent Oakmore elaborated the reasons behind his feelings, sparing no amount of drama in his retelling. A boy, stolen away from his ailing love and transported to a strange world where he obviously does not belong, with no recollection of his relocation or knowledge of how to return. Despite the regent's garish bardic skills, I managed to feel some empathy for the human. I had been a youngling when Bolasir went to war against the demons, and my world changed forever. I remember how lost I felt when my daily decisions went from mundane to grave in the blink of an eye. I had my parents to guide me through this transition, though. The human does not. I will consider it. How would my assistance be applied? I asked. Before Oakmore could answer, something unexpected happened. Excuse me, Your Majesty, Nick said. Can you understand me now?